holiday of Sukkot is the third of the three major Jewish holidays on the Jewish calendar. This holiday, therefore, features as one of its main symbols the dwelling places of the Israelites in the desert. By capturing that, we appreciate the themes of impermanence, of transience, of the fragility of life, because these are structures that are subject to the elements. And so it gives us a whole another appreciation of what it means to have a home, and also what it means, therefore, to be homeless.
I think the way that the Sukkah project started was the first year was really almost by accident. We were looking for a project for foundation level students who are typically focused on smaller scale projects and need something just to sort of start with design. And particularly I was looking for something that might be able to engage them in this idea of a sort of parametric or rule-based system that could get them to explore things like scale and material in a very tangible way. And so almost by accident, I was discussing this with a colleague, Catherine Hamill, and she had mentioned it to her neighbor subsequently, who happened to be a member of a local synagogue, and they were quite interested actually right away in coming in, speaking to the students, and discussing the project and how sort of design thinking might influence something that they had been doing for years as a sort of, they had a community sukkah.
Jason was looking at some pictures of some sukkahs on his, I saw it on the screen, and I asked him what that was. And he said it was a sukkah, and I had no idea what that was. And then he said he was thinking of doing that as one of the smaller projects in the studio too, that he and I were each teaching a separate section.
To see this go from an idea to a college course to now really what is 5 years of the Sukkot competition with the Department of Architecture at the university, to me has been just a fabulous, fabulous endeavor. How great that we as a congregation have this as a sort of almost an outreach, I use that with quotations, to the university and the Department of Architecture.
You know, in the course, so that the students would come up with the designs after we had our initial conversation about the themes of the holiday and so forth. And then they would come back and I would look at their initial designs. And none of them were such that I just said, no, this completely won't work. It was always, well, this one's interesting and it has some real definite possibilities, but it has some issues, some challenges here in terms of, you know, where are we going to put the covering, or how's that going to be placed in there, or how many, does it have the requisite number of sides, or is the height proper, or so. You know, I would sort of steer them in those directions, but as for their ideas, I tried to get those to be flexible enough and to adapt them so that they would constitute an acceptable religious framework for the design. Sukkah was based on the idea of gratitude. So as I mentioned, the holiday has an agricultural element. It's a harvest holiday. It's a Thanksgiving holiday. It's a biblical Thanksgiving holiday. So people are sharing the bounty of their produce, of what they've grown, with each other, and this is the food that's going to last them through the winter. So it's a very important time. Like any harvest, there's a sense of anxiety about it. You don't know whether the weather's going to cooperate, whether you're going to have a plague of locusts come and eat all of your crops. It's just always a little bit of a precarious time in people's lives. So when the harvest does come in, people are grateful and they see what they have, and that's where the expression of gratitude comes from. And so the holiday is an expression of gratitude to God, who's, from a religious point of view, the author of all life and nature in particular. So the idea of connecting it to food was a very logical one. I mean, it really made a lot of sense. And putting the cans in the holes really made it something where people literally could come and take food if they were hungry. So let those who were hungry come and eat. And people did take cans out. There was one congregant that said to me, "Rabbi, there's people taking food from the sukkah." And I said, "Yeah, that's exactly what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a food pantry in a sense. It's a place where people can contribute their excess, and people that are in need can take." And that was exactly what we wanted to happen. The food that was eventually left, and I think there were about 700 holes for food. We filled up the whole sukkah, and so we had this just wonderful donation that we were able to make to the food banks. And that was a really positive thing. So it combined celebrating the holiday and giving tangible expression to the idea of gratitude, not just through words, but through action.
Bringing communities together was an integral aspect of this for me. I think having the university and the synagogue family and community engaged gives us an opportunity to bring cultures together. And within the synagogue family, a Jewish community has existed in our larger Calgary-wide community since the city was founded, really, essentially. And having bridges built in communities is always a very, very positive initiative.
I think the most interesting component of that project was that it really engaged a lot of hands-on activity from the community. So there were kids putting stuff into the facade. There was it's sort of an indestructible tank compared to a lot of the other projects, which are much more, let's say, they take on board the idea of fragility in a much more explicit way than the Sukkah, which is probably the most robust of the projects. So one of the interesting aspects of these projects is that the students come to them with a lot of different faith backgrounds, or perhaps no faith background. And so a lot of the early thinking about the projects is really about how do we get into the narrative of the festival. And thinking about this idea of sort of moving through the desert and how you might find refuge in some sort of cave or rock formation through that kind of travel. So I think that as a kind of basis, trying to ground the project in something that was not a sort of overtly religious interpretation of the object, but maybe more related to the kind of notions of refuge and kind of the tactile nature of these sort of big canyon walls in the desert.
Sukkah wall was more abstract, and as such, people had to stop for a moment, sort of think about what this sukkah was conveying about the holiday. And as I said, because of the undulating shape of the sukkah, it was intentional in terms of bringing people into the wilderness. So it transformed and transported people from an asphalt parking lot into the Sinai Desert. And that was just fascinating.
The process the students went through in designing and conceiving configurations so that this would be something that would endure, I thought was fantastic. It was innovative in looking at the sukkah from two sides, the exterior and interior of the wall, and how people really related to the motion that was achieved by the various striations of movement, and being able to look into it to see the dimension of it, how it reticulated up and down, created a rhythm. And with Sukkot, there is music engaged and happiness. It's a festival, so it had a joyful expression all on its own, and that resonated very successfully with me.
A lot of people, when they saw that, they were thinking of Star Wars, or they were thinking of some fantasy sukkah. They didn't quite get the triangular route involved in it. And once they sort of read some of it, it became much more apparent to people.
If you look at it on a map, their journey that they took was a triangulated shape, just without a closed top. So what we did was really stay true to that journey that they took, keeping that triangulated edge, and then literally just extruding it, pulling it, and playing with that triangulation so that it's from the perforations of, if you actually laid down this thing flat, instead of it being all kinked in on itself, it would make that triangle with the perforations.
This was, by the abstract nature of it, very engaging, because it forced people to see things in it. And I'm sure people saw a lot of different things as they would looking at a piece of art. You know, the mind has an interpretive ability, but the idea of tracing the route and using that as a theme with the triangle that, of course, forms the Jewish star, all of that connected beautifully as well. And so people had a sense of movement, of, again, sort of going from point A to point B, but not in a linear fashion, but rather in a more circuitous way.
The thing that's quite funny about a lot of these projects is that students often struggle with the idea of scale. So when this one is photographed without people in it, it seems like a completely reasonable proposal. But we really need like a tiny person sitting inside this one to make the scale make sense, because the idea of inhabiting this one is a bit far-fetched. That said, I think as a sort of formal and material exploration, it's actually one that was quite it was iterated through maybe the most of all of them. So the students actually worked on how materials might come together, the details between holding materials together, and really considered all of the idea of sort of luminance and light passing through this thing in a way that I think a lot of the other projects didn't.
It was interesting. There was a lot of like, okay, like let's do like this weird like angle thing, and it's just like, no, like let's like just make it like a linear, like bring it down to its basic geography components, and it's a triangle. Like that's what it is. So let's keep it to that instead of trying to make like a weird, you know, like kind of triangle, kind of like, because I mean a path is never perfect in terms of walking. So we kind of kept, we narrowed it down to be as linear as possible, and then inverted that into the actual project itself.
Well, our project was basically to, create the architectural embodiment of, the history, let me put it that way, because the project kind of, in literal and metaphorical terms, tried to convey several key aspects of their history and put it in physical form.
It brought in another aspect of the holiday that hadn't been touched upon by the other Sukkot. So that was the one that really played on the Star of David, and used the rotating idea of the triangle to get people to imagine how the Jewish star was captured in this structure as well, symbol of Judaism. It also was the symbol of, because of the four different sort of vectors here. It was a symbol of the four species as well. So there's a lulav, etrog, arava, and hadas. These are the four different plants that are used to symbolize the harvest, and so it evoked those different symbols as well.
The interesting aspects of, again, this project, which I would say is sort of building off the one before it, is this idea of a layered system. In fact, most of the projects have some sort of layering between a kind of plastic translucent material and then a sort of natural wood material. And I've found that to be an interesting interpretation in all of them, in terms of how do you describe something temporary through the materiality of the object. And I think, they've struggled with different ways to do that while still making something that doesn't fall down, and avoiding making this sort of super rigid box. So this project again was a sort of iterative process that a lot of the iteration probably happened, I would say, more in a digital environment than it did with sort of physical prototyping. So it sort of pushes the limits of what you can do with laser cut joints, in that it is in a lot of ways quite fragile, and yet when it's held together, it's pretty rigid once built on site. But the sort of transportation and storage of this one has been quite a challenge. The surface of this thing is great. There's a kind of treatment of that surface that, the students spent hours with, like, hot air, with sort of heat guns and hair dryers and sort of boat wrap plastic, trying to get just the right kind of texture and pattern out of the surface. And I think, when you see the light pass through this thing, it's really pretty amazing. And, again, a sort of tribute to the dedication that they have to resolve these things through a kind of design process.
The other thing I think with the rabbi was wonderful is how much he was open to all the ideas. I mean, one of them was, I think, an ice island that melted over time, and he quite liked the range and the interpretation of what the sukkah was about.
Last Sukkah was the subject to change Sukkah, which took the letters of the Hebrew letters of the word Sukkah. So there's 3 letters. There's the closed, then there's a 3-sided, and then the hey, the last letter, is 2-sided with a kind of a partial side here. So the tradition says you can build a Sukkah in the shape of any one of those letters, and it's then proper. So those letters then evoked the different ways in which the sukkah could potentially be built, and by changing them around, it gave us a whole nother perspective on the meaning of the letters, because in Hebrew each letter has a numerical equivalent, and each letter has sort of a mystical meaning to it. So those sort of powerful messages came through by just looking at the letter.
So the vision for Sukkah number 5 was that we wanted it to be different for everyone who engaged it. So there is a lot of symbolism and meaning baked into the form. So the 3 Hebrew letters for Sukkah are projected onto 3 of the elevations, and that yields a kind of space or an object. So depending on where you approach it from, and also depending on the way that the object is oriented on the ground, you're able to read it differently. There's also a lot of history in terms of the Sukkot of wandering through the desert. And so we have these sort of meandering edges that run through the form. So there's this notion of discovery and arrival that's also, again, baked into the form.
Like our sukkah was in 7 parts. So constructing the first part and fabricating that first part was a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
But after we got that first one done, the rest went pretty smoothly. We had a good system down. We had a good kind of order of assembly and knew what we were doing. The design phase kind of consisted of about around 2 months, and during that time we came up with a bunch of ideas, tested them kind of with ourselves, making models and kind of just exploring different avenues, and then we got a design that we were happy with, and that time we kind of presented it to Shaw. So about 2 months of, well, maybe less than 2 months, maybe a month of construction, and then about a month of kind of logistics, planning, getting our fabrication files ready, lining up suppliers, lining up different fabricators that we're going to do out of house. And then it was a real kind of solid month and a half of fabrication in the shop every day, working with the CNC, playing with foam.
Breathing in foam.
I think the idea of embedding the sort of characters into the project, again, the kind of challenge with all of these has been, how do you communicate an idea within a formal strategy to people who are not trained in design? And so in this case, they had this really sort of smart idea of taking the kind of characters, that sort of Jewish characters that made up the words around Sukkot, and translating them into a kind of formal gesture.
My post-professional research was very much investigating computer vision and the opportunities of multiple readings on single static objects. And so, Josh and I were obviously talking a lot about it at that time, and there was just a discussion we were having at that point. And so he conceptualized a sukkah that could have many different meanings when viewed from many different points of view. So there's just a dialogue going on at least with Josh and I at the time, about like multiplicities of readings, blurriness, how you could understand things as different, like the same thing in different ways, both through kind of physical observation and computer vision, machine vision or algorithmic observation. Working in the laboratory for integrative design, we really try to take a holistic view of how we're going to execute the problem and understand that moving from point A to point B is not always a straight line, but seeing how we can compartmentalize and break down the problem in a rational manner so that we can build in contingencies. About building a robust work plan that really allows us to execute in an efficient manner, but understanding that there's always going to be hiccups, trying to anticipate them the best as possible, but understanding the tools at our disposal well enough that we can kind of bully them to make them do what we do when things don't go the way we want.
Giving the students the opportunity to learn about Jewish background, Jewish history, culture, religious beliefs, gave us the opportunity to dialogue with them about their backgrounds as well, open a much broader discussion, learn about their backgrounds, hear a little bit about that from them, and why this project resonated with them. I think that was one of the successes, is it wasn't just our project and they were fulfilling academic requirements. I think the fact that they took the time to learn about our beliefs, why this holiday resonates, why it's important within our festival structures, that was a real plus for us. You want to see something have a life, be sustainable in a new environment, and be able to stand on its own and reveal something new to everyone each time they come through the space. And that's what this does.
We worked at a Waves coffee shop one time. There was a guy who looked over our shoulder and was super emphatic. He was just like, "That's an amazing design. I love what you're doing." And we literally hadn't even told him anything about it. He just had come along and seen our 3D model and was excited. And then we told him about the Sukkah thing, and he was like, "Even better, I love Judaism." And it was really fun to see like the reaction that our